Okay, this paper is about event studies and proposed improvement in the event study methodology. So just for background, the event study is a big idea. In Google Scholar, you get thousands and thousands of string search hits for the word event study. And as all of us know, while event studies began with stock market returns data, they've actually gone into all kinds of places. Today, people do event studies about countries, about households, about GDP, about exchange rate. So the basic idea has really taken root. Here is a graph of the trend in the use of the word event studies and so on in the books of the world. So from the late 60s onwards, this thing has really worked. It has become an important part of our apparatus. Now, why is the event study such a nice methodology? There are two parts to it. And in this paper, I take one part as it is, and I try to improve on the second part. The first sweet idea of the event study is rearrange things into event time. It's a simple, brilliant idea. And there is a clear causal ordering where there is an event, and then there are things that happen after the event. It's a bit like Granger causality. So there's a clear interpretation of what is going on. That was the first big idea. And there is an obvious point I like to make, which helps to clarify the mind. We are also used to doing an event study after running a market model and extracting the residuals. So I want to make the conceptual point. Hypothetically, you did no adjustment. The event study methodology is still valid. It's just inefficient because there's more noise going on. The ordering into event time is the huge step forward. And then if you have sufficiently large data sets, you will get precise answers. You will get sharp answers. And the market model adjustment is a tool for reducing noise, for improving the precision. So then comes part two of the event study, which is why don't we use the market index as a control? There are many things going on. So you're thinking that there's a treated stock, and then that the market index is a counterfactual that if there had been nothing else going on, what would have happened to the stock? And that we get out of the market model. We are hoping there is some kind of linearity there. Okay, so this is the broad idea of the event study. And again, I just want to say, this looks very good in 2014. There's very little else out of 1969 econometrics that looks so sophisticated today. Okay, so it was a great advance. Now, just to think about the averaging that is going on and the market model residuals that are going on. Suppose you have returns Rj that are normally distributed with mean mu and variance sigma squared. So if hypothetically you do no adjustment and you have m events, then that averaging is taking you to a imprecision of the sample mean, which is sigma by root m. And what people are typically doing is that we estimate a market model, so that gives you a 30% reduction in that variance. Okay, so you're getting some gains out of that market model. Now, we know by now that the one-factor model is not a very good description of what happens in asset prices. The Pharma-French three-factor model has added size and book to price, and hundreds and thousands of papers have persuaded us that there is no ignoring size and there is no ignoring book to price, that we should really take it seriously. So the logical next step is that instead of doing a market model with one explanatory variable, that is the market index, we do three explanatory variables, the additional Pharma-French factors. And this generally gives a further nice improvement in the variance reduction. And this is fairly well known, and it is starting to get used. So increasingly, we are starting to see event study and other applied papers which are using these kinds of ideas. Now, that's the jumping off point for this paper, where I asked the question, can we do better? Is there something we can do carrying these ideas forward, and can we do it better? The key insight is, what if size and book to price matter? And what if the world is not too linear? Okay, so it is one proposition to say that size and book to price are incredibly important empirical asset pricing factors. It is another thing to say we will live in a linear world. So the relationships may not be entirely linear. Okay, so that here's another conjecture for an alternative strategy. So suppose we think size really matters, and suppose we think book to price really matters, and I'm looking at a firm. So there is a firm, there's an event. Say I'm doing an event study of the death of a CEO. So there's a firm, on a certain date the CEO dies, and I want the counterfactual, I want a control. What if we just pulled up a bunch of companies who had a similar size and a similar book to price? Okay, is that a non-parametric way of getting a control? That this is the stock market performance of what would have happened on and around the event date if there had been no death of the CEO. Okay, and the beauty is that if I'm able to identify K companies with a similar size and similar book to price, I don't have to take a stand on the linearity of the market models, on the linearity of my asset pricing theory. So what we do in this paper is that we identify K partners using nearest neighbor Mahalanobis distance matching. Okay, so imagine there are 30 firms where you have observed an event and you wish to do an event study. The proposed strategy is that one by one you go over each firm. For each firm, you find K partners. It's hard work, it's compute intensive. For each firm, you find K partners who have a low distance in the Mahalanobis distance of that two-dimensional space where one dimension is size and the other dimension is book to price. And then you construct that counterfactual time series. You could either call it a firm-specific counterfactual or you could call it a firm-specific stock market index. Okay, and there are in turn two ways in which you could make that index, which is to use equal weights or to weight each firm based on the inverse of the distance. So I've got K firms, so I've got diversification, but some firms are closer in the Mahalanobis distance against the treated firm. So I weight by that distance. So that gives you two different methods. Bottom line is you end up with the returns on a customized market index, which I'm calling RM prime T, and then you get a residual for the day where you just subtract out that. Okay, so this is the conjecture that firm by firm, we go do matching and find K partners, and that gives us the counterfactual, that what would have happened to this firm if there had been no event. It gives us a control. So it gives us a measure of what was happening in the world other than the information that is being picked up by this event. So what's the intuition? If you want a control for the stock, look for other firms that are the same size and control. There's no need for a market model type regression. You've got a customized stock market index, and this is like treatment and control. And this is all lots of computation, and that's okay. In the 21st century, we can compute our way to doing this. So what is the data we use for this? We use all the listed firms in India for some Monte Carlo exercises. This is drawn from the CMI Prowess database, and we use the Pharma French factors which Jayant Verma has so helpfully released for the public on his website. It's a great public resource that he has produced. I just want to use, describe some phrases. So ER is a phrase we use for a simple adjustment strategy where you just take stock returns and subtract out the market index. is the market model where you estimate the beta and then you subtract out to get the residual. Augmented market model is where you also put currency factor. So you have stock market index and the exchange rate. Then there is the Pharma French three-factor model. And then there is what we call M1 and M2. M1 is with equal weights. M2 is with inverse distance weights. This is the most important graph. The rest flows inexorably from this. So here's what's going on. What we're doing is that we take a large number of firms and we pick random dates. We just think of imaginary event dates. And then we apply these procedures and we construct the residual. And the question is, what's the variance of the residual? So a good matching technology gives you a high match between treatment and control. So the variance of the residual should be lower. Okay? So what you're seeing is the cumulative density function of a couple of different alternatives. So the red curve, the bottom curve, which is the highest variances, is the conventional market model. Is it slightly away from that is the augmented market model where you also bring currency into the picture. There's not much gain. Then blue is a big gain. It is the Pharma French factors with linearity. And then the green at the top is a very big gain, which is saying that, you know, this is not a linear world, that size and book to price matter a lot, but not in a simple linear way. So matching by size and price to book is giving a huge gain on top of running linear models involving the Pharma French factors. So this is the main story of this paper, that going and carefully constructing a control firm by firm is giving a big gain compared with the conventional idea of using a regression-based control. And actually, you know what, this is not new. This is happening all across statistics. Everywhere you look in statistics, this is one big idea that is transforming empirical economics today, that we use matching, we go closer to each unit, we find a partner for that unit. We don't just run regressions and do some extrapolation. Okay, now let's go to a power study. A good estimator is able to reject H0 when H0 is false. And the real challenge is to be able to reject H0 when the effect size is small. So it's a relatively small shock. And when the data size is small, when you have a small sample. And as a thumb rule, statisticians become happy when you have an estimator that rejects H0 with probability of 0.7. when H0 is false. That's considered reasonably good power. So we set up a standard simulation. This is Brown-Warner 1980 style simulation. The only difference is that the inference procedure we use is a bootstrap. We don't use the old style classical inference. So we're doing bootstrap inference for event studies. So here is the results where the true shock size is 1%. Okay, so there is a 1% abnormal return which has been artificially injected into a randomly chosen set of firms on a randomly chosen set of dates. Let me explain the first row of the table. It's a sample size of 5. So it's a really small data set. You've observed only 5 events. Okay? And it's a really small shock size. It's 1% returns of a shock size. A market model rejects the null with a 23% probability, and M1, M2, the new methods, reject the null with 33 and 40% probability. So it's a significant gain compared to conventional practice. The pharma French linear formulation gets you to 26%, but we go much better with a 33 or a 40%. Go to the bottom. Suppose there are 25 events. So there are 25 firms in your data set, and it's a 1% shock. The pharma French 3 factors gets you up to 64% probability of rejecting the null. M1, M2 gets you to 85%. So once again, it's a significant gain in power compared with pharma French. Of course, you're vastly ahead of market model, which is at 47%. This is a shock size of 1%. You do this with 2%, you're getting nice similar results. You do this with 3%. Now by 3%, it's too easy. For a 3% shock, the market model works with 25 firms. So if you think of a very generic event study you may have seen in the literature, you sort of have 25 events, you'll have a 3% shock. So that the market model is working reasonably well. You're getting an 85% rejection probability. And the improved methods are not adding a whole lot. M1, M2 are getting you to 90%. So yeah, there is a gain, but the gains are not large. What is novel here is when you're dealing with small effect sizes and small samples. That's where the real value added of the new techniques is coming in. So bottom line, what have we achieved in this paper? We've got an improvement upon a very important toolkit, a very important element of our empirical finance toolkit, which is the event study methodology. We've got an ability to discern smaller shocks with smaller data sets. Even if you have bigger data sets, of course, we always want more efficiency. So there's nothing bad with using this method for bigger data sets, but the gains are small. So I think the important thing here is that it extends the applicability of the event study methodology. Traditionally, we have thought 5, 10 events is too little. We have thought 1%, 2% shock sizes is too small. We don't have the discerning power. We don't have the resolving power to be able to pick it up. I think that's the important novelty here, that we are able to go towards research designs and questions and problems which were previously considered a bit out of reach, that you just didn't have enough data to be able to answer those questions. In the spirit of reproducible research, everything in this paper is in an R package. This is the first presentation of this paper. Within a week or two, this code will also be in this package. Event Studies is a platform for conducting event studies and for doing research on the event study methodology. It implements standard techniques, and it has recent methodological innovation. So there is one block of methodological novelty on doing extreme event studies, which is already in the package. And this paper will be in the package. What could you do further building on this in the future? I wish to say 2 things, one connected with event studies and one which is not so connected with event studies. We are getting excited at what you can do with one event. Okay? One event is called a case study. It's not an event study. But we are finding that there are a range of interesting effect sizes and situations where actually you're studying one stock, one event. There was a product launched by Apple. You want to understand, did something happen to the Apple stock price? We're finding that the matching technology is actually giving you so much of an improvement in power that you could actually use it to talk sense about one event. The second is that we have used size and book to price, which are the classic pharma French factors, but the empirical asset pricing literature has talked about many other candidates. Maybe they matter here. The third is that we arbitrarily chose that for each firm, we will match against 50 partners by nearest neighbor. There's nothing magical about 50 other than this being the size of the NSE 50 index. Maybe there is some room for exploration. Then the fourth idea is, again, drawn from the field of matching. One of the big ideas in the field of matching, and this is absolutely novel compared to what we do in mainstream economics, is that you are better off throwing away many observations. Okay, so here's my intuition. In a classic corporate finance paper, it is a catastrophe for a regression if Reliance is in. And this is for two reasons. First, you only have the ability to understand a treatment effect when there is a reasonable control. There will be no control for Reliance. Reliance is so much bigger than any other firm in the country. You will never have match balance in a data set. There will never be something like a treatment and a control in one data set if Reliance is one of the firms. So you're never going to get a match. Further, Reliance is an outlier in any regression you do. It is an influential observation. It's mucking up your results. So now in that same logic, if I try to find a book to price and size that is close to Reliance in this methodology, the answer will be, you know what, there is no partner. So by this logic, you should not even be doing event studies involving the really giant companies of the country like Reliance, where you really don't have a control. Or you wage war separately on trying to find counterfactuals with a very different technology for the very large firms. And I think this is an interesting new insight which we bring into event studies, which is understood and mainstream in statistics. So in the matching literature with treatments and controls, it's standard procedure. You throw away 90% of your data to get to rats who really are like each other. That there's a treatment, there's a control, they're a lot like each other. That produces credibility. We don't do this with event studies. We just throw lots of data in, but maybe we should be. So this is a novel way of thinking about event studies that comes because we're coming at it from a matching state of mind. Then fifth idea, as we know in the event studies literature, long horizon is a real problem. I have an opinion on what's going on. It's bad matches. Okay, the market model is a very bad counterfactual. And as you go over longer time horizons, it's really untenable and you're getting into so much trouble. So perhaps the matching approach is going to give us better long horizon studies. We have to see. We've not done this work. Finally, could you use this kind of stuff for pairs trading? What does this tell us about asset pricing theory? That the linear pharma French factors don't do so well. But when I use size and price to book to do matching, then I get an extremely close match. I think it gives us some intuition into the world, and maybe we should follow up with this. So that's it. That's this paper. Thank you.
This is a paper that I liked, and I know what I really have is a slightly different interpretation of what is going on, and that's what I will talk about. But yes, it is a very, very, very interesting way of doing it, something which is very, very important and useful as well. I would only add that, Ajay talked about n is equal to 1 as something that, we don't do. Yeah, we don't do in the academic work. But in the litigation world, that's done very, very frequently. The entire fraud on the markets doctrine in the US would compute damages using essentially a very crude n is equal to 1 kind of a thing. So that's probably, if you want to monetize this, the litigation world would probably pay you more than what the academics would. Yeah, and well, I think Ajay put it in one way that the Ball and Brown and FFJR are standing up today. The other way of looking at it is that these are kind of fossilized technologies. We developed a technology 50 years ago, and we haven't really made any radical advance in the implementation of that technology. And anything which gets us there would, of course, be extremely valuable. Okay, now where I differ is how I interpret what is going on. So let me talk about, okay. So let's go back to asset pricing theory, and you look at asset pricing on one side and the factor structure of stock returns on the other. And you have a distinction between pricing factors and risk factors. When you talk about any multi-factor model, you're interested not only in factors which come up in a principal component analysis or a factor analysis. You're interested in factors which are priced in the market. And that is what comes in here. So the important thing for something to enter an asset pricing model is not that it explains a large part of the cross-sectional variance. That's not necessary at all. What is important is that it has a strong role in affecting the expected return. Factor betas must have factor premiums. So, but on the other hand, if I'm using it in an event study, I'm not trying to measure expected returns. I am measuring actually realized returns on a particular day. And then it is not important that that factor be a priced factor at all. So let me take an extreme example. Suppose the security market line is flat or even negatively sloped, so that CAPM is utterly useless as an equilibrium asset pricing model. But I run a regression of stock on a market index and I get an R squared of 0.55. The market model is great for an event study, because the event study is not saying that it predicts E of R correctly. It's only predicting it's only removing a part of the variance and improving the efficiency. So the market model does not swim or sink with the CAPM, and nor do any of the other factor pricing models do either. So for example, I can put industry factors into an event study, at least if all the events are not in the same industry, I can do that. Even if my theory says that industry factors cannot be priced. The second thing that can happen is when we look at factors versus characteristics. In an asset pricing world, I cannot put characteristics into my model, I can put only factors. And why is that so? That's a simple arbitrage argument. For example, I cannot say in an asset pricing world that small firms have higher expected return than large firms. Why? Because if that were true, then all that I would have to do is to build a conglomerate which goes and buys 100 small firms at cheap prices, and I become a big firm and my cost of capital declines and I have made an arbitrage profit. What Farmer French will say is that no, you can't do that, but I can put the size factor into the regression, because the size factor is not the size characteristic. A large firm can load on the size factor simply because it comes up with a large beta on the size factor. That I can put because that's a factor, that's a risk factor and not this. So if I take the same conglomerate example, if I buy 100 companies, my size beta will not change because my divisions all have the same size beta and my average beta will be the average of those divisional betas. So I have become a big firm, but I'm a small firm for in my factor pricing model, my size beta will be that of a small firm. This is the constraint that I have when I'm building an equilibrium pricing model. But this constraint does not apply when I'm doing an event study, because in an event study, I'm not computing an equilibrium at all. I can put characteristics into that. And one of the things that we know in empirical finance is that if you run a horse race between characteristics and factors, characteristics win hands down every time. If you run a regression on actual firm size versus the Farmer French model and you calculate R squares, it is almost certain that the R squared on actual firm size will be bigger than the R squared on factors. So characteristics win hands down in cross-sectional variance explanation. So what you really have is that I can, in an event study, I can use characteristics. And what I interpret Ajay is doing when he computes the Mahalanobis distance is really that he is using actual size and actual price to book as characteristics. And he's putting that into the event study model, which Farmer French cannot do. Farmer French cannot put actual size and actual price to book because it's an equilibrium pricing model. And what I think the big contribution that I see here is saying that why is the event study world so bothered about that fixation that pricing factors have to be factors and not characteristics? Why are we bothered about whether a factor is a priced factor or not? We just put a bunch of characteristics there. We just explain a large part of the cross-sectional variance covariance matrix, and then we are done because we have got the residual. What we want is a model which reduces the variance of the idiosyncratic residual. And that is what I think is happening there. So, I think, sorry. I think what Mahalanobis is doing indirectly is really regression on characteristics. And it is not really trying to approximate a nonlinear Farmer French model. But I also have a thought that this nonlinearity is also important because if you think about it as an optimal regression, optimal predictor, okay, and if you think about it purely abstractly, okay, and I'm going to completely ignore Bhagwan's dictum that you put any math into it, everybody switches off. the way to think about this is that there is a probability space, and there is a bunch of random variables there, and I want a mean squared closest fit. What you really have is that you have a Hilbert space, and you want the closest approximation to this in that Hilbert space. And standard Hilbert space theory will tell you that the closest that you can get will be a projection in that Hilbert space, and therefore it will be linear. In that Hilbert space, it's a linear projection that's going to happen. But in that Hilbert space, I need a bunch of basis vectors which are not necessarily just the raw security returns. And what do I need to get the full set, a full basis for the entire Hilbert space? I need to put nonlinear transforms of the security prices into it. And how do I do that? Well, in the derivatives market, we have that. We know that any nonlinear payoff can be arbitrarily well approximated by a portfolio of call options. Right? This is a standard result because 3 options give you a butterfly spread, and a butterfly spread arbitrarily closely approximates a Dirac delta function, and a bunch of Dirac delta functions gives you an arbitrary function. So if you want to span the entire Hilbert space, what you need to do is that you need to put not just the stocks, you basically need to put a full bunch of call options on the stock as well. So the way to make it nonlinear is that, and if you don't do it on all stocks, at least you put it on the Nifty. You put call and put options on the Nifty as additional securities and allow them to enter your regression. Then the chances that you're probably spanning the entire Hilbert space, and then you project onto that, it should be an even more optimal kind of a thing. That's, I think, if you want to pursue nonlinearity, that I think is the way to go. And those who switched off when I mentioned Hilbert spaces can wake up again. I think I had the wrong set of slides, so I think this is probably not there. Now, what is the danger in going down this path? Okay, and there's not a danger that you're going to see when you do these Monte Carlo simulations. But when you do that in real life, I think there is a problem, which is this, that the universe of affected firms is not always very clearly defined. So imagine a scenario like this, that you looked at the event and said, these are 100 firms which are very clearly affected by the event, and you took those 100 firms. It is perfectly possible in a real-life application that there are 20 other firms which were only marginally affected. You kept them out. Now, when you do a Mahalanobis kind of a thing, is there a risk that some of those firms which were partly affected by the event are ending up in your control? And how do you deal with this problem? This is a risk that I see when you go down this matching kind of a thing. It is absolutely important that the event and the control, the treated firms are very, very accurately defined. And this is not necessarily the case, that quite often what helps a bunch of firms will, to a slightly later extent, maybe 30% impact on a bunch of other firms. Every firm, for example, every supplier to any of these firms is also possibly going to be impacted, maybe 10%, 20%, and this is the risk that I see there. And I think that's all that I had. But I think this is a very, very interesting way of looking at it. And this is something that obviously needs to be done, because this is really the workhorse of a lot of finance work, the event study. And it's great to see some progress after 50 years of, BNB and FFGR. Yeah, thank you.
Ajay, can I ask you a question? There are procedures. Cluster analysis has a bunch of procedures like McQueen's K-means. How is your thing different from that? It looks like it's exactly the same.
I think cluster analysis is about saying, here's a data set, find me the clusters. Here we are different. We are saying, I have a firm where I know an event took place. So there's the death of a CEO. I know in this firm the CEO died on this date. Now find me the firms who are closest to this around some characteristics. So we're using Mahalanobis distance as a multivariate distance metric, and then you do a nearest neighbor algorithm to find the 50 firms who are in the closest ball surrounding the firm that was treated.
See, my dissertation was using one of them, and pretty much the idea there was you have a sample group of firms and you want to get a bunch of control firms to do your testing. And the McQueen's k-means procedure essentially does across these k dimensions where you are essentially talking about these characteristics like market cap, liquidity, whatever it is, and then you identify the distance, minimizing the distance across these k dimensions, and then you identify those clusters which are like all the group of firms that belong in the cluster essentially form part of this sample and controls.
Can we sit and talk about it? I don't know that field. Yes, Pradeep?
This difference between what Venki is talking about and what the measure you have used, the Mahalanobis distance, is that the Mahalanobis distance is kind of standardized distance as distinct from Euclidean distance?
Yeah, it's just a standardized distance.
Okay. Which is, in your case, it's a Euclidean distance, so that's potentially a difference.
Yes, Rick?
So there are some papers in event studies that use what is called characteristic adjusted returns, which basically they take the universe of stocks and they'll say divide it into 5 groups of size. Within every group of size, divide it into 5 groups of book to market. Now you have 25 groups. So pick any event stock. That entire portfolio is the control for that. And I've been guilty of using this sort of and it seems that your procedure would improve upon this. So it might be useful to benchmark against that as well.
Good idea. Yeah. But basically, we're going one step further, saying we have no computational constraints in the 21st century. So for every single firm, I go find a carefully customized answer. Whereas that 5x5 thing was more a computational convenience, that you sort of create 25 portfolios, keep them fixed, and then place each firm into one of those bins.
Right. But it would be, given that your procedure is sort of closer to this, the pharma fringe benchmark is not the appropriate sort of comparison, I think.
Agree.
If I could say, also the advantage of his is that when you choose your own method of, say, comparison firms, then, biases sink in and stuff. This other method is more agnostic, right? It's kind of more general. So it would be a good benchmark, good way to think about it. Right. If you're choosing your own, then people will say, why did you choose these 30 and not those, where you data mining?
Yeah, so we need to do some research around this methodology and agree on some workhorse methods.
Yeah, right.
And then in steady state, people will just be, running some code and it will be doing this whole thing. So it's not like people will be fishing for what's a convenient match.
Yeah.
Wow. We did a good job. It is actually 4:40. I'm getting to go home earlier. Thank you all very much. The speakers, the discussants, the people who sat around and listened and asked questions and comments. I thought this was a great day. Very interesting papers. And I hope all of you learned something and enjoyed it too. So we'll meet tomorrow at 9 o'clock. For the first session of the day. I think that there will be food and breakfast served outside even before for those people who are enthusiastic to come earlier. So thank you all very much. Round of applause to everyone and see you tomorrow.